Welcome back, everyone. We have another video in the Julius Caesar playlist by Historia Civilis. I'm glad you're here with me. We have Caesar versus Ariovistus. Same year, 58 B.C.E. Continuing, basically we saw Caesar defeat the Helvetii. Well, sort of, not really. Like, I guess that he defeated him by way of truce, but not militarily, I would say. More on a pressured situation. Now, what happens with Ariovistus? I don't even know what we got going on here, so let's jump right into it. Lego!
Shortly after Caesar's victory over the Helvetii, he received a barrage of messages from Gallic tribes, thanking him for dealing with the invaders and congratulating him on his victory.
Okay.
They then asked if they could come and see him in person. It was all quite mysterious, and they insisted that everybody take an oath of secrecy before the meeting. Once face to face, they told Caesar about a German king named Ariovistus. Apparently, Ariovistus had been invited across the Rhine by some Gallic tribe to intervene in a dispute, and had just started to gobble up territory for himself.
And it's hard to imagine, with the Roman Empire going on and everyone believing, of course, this is the top dog in terms of politics and world order. It's hard to think that there's these local and regional politics that is going on because it's just it's not documented as much or talked about enough. So that's kind of like the interesting part about these videos, especially like this one, is learning a little bit deeper into these interpersonal politics.
He then began to bring large numbers of Germans across the Rhine in an effort to colonize his new territory. He now had 120,000 Germans living in Gaul, with plans to bring more. As a cherry on top, Ariovistus had also attacked Rome's closest ally in Gaul, and had forced them to disavow their treaty with the Romans, and to provide an annual tribute to Ariovistus instead. Nobody in Gaul was happy about this. The Gauls then got to the point of this secret meeting. They formally asked Caesar to intervene on their behalf. Caesar agreed to meet with Ariovistus to see if he could get him to moderate his behavior.
He is the sword in this scenario.
I don't want to make it sound like Caesar was doing this for altruistic reasons. A law had been passed in 61 BCE instructing all governors of Transalpine Gaul to protect Rome's Gallic allies whenever they were able.
I mean, I wouldn't downplay the aid because it could still go against the policy.
In other words, Caesar had a mandate from Rome to act on this if he wanted to. But
if he wanted to.
Even more to the point, Ariovistus was encroaching on Rome's sphere of influence, and doing nothing in response would do some real damage to Rome's credibility in the region. Caesar sent a message to Ariovistus, asking for a meeting on neutral ground. Ariovistus wrote back, saying, "No, if you want to meet, come to me."
Oh.
Obviously, negotiations were off to a great start. Caesar sent a second message, reminding Ariovistus that Caesar had been the one to legitimize his rise to power during his year as consul. This was a not-so-veiled threat. He was saying, "I made you. I could easily unmake you." Caesar then listed his demands. First, he instructed Ariovistus to immediately stop bringing Germans across the Rhine. Second, he instructed him to return all of his Gallic hostages.
Oh.
Third, he told him to immediately cease all military activity. Ariovistus sent a simple reply. He said that the Romans were free to run their conquests as they saw fit, and so was he. Cheeky. Around the same time, Caesar also received two pieces of intelligence. First, he got word that Ariovistus had mobilized an army and was marching on his neighbors again. Second, he started to get reports of hundreds of thousands of Germans on the other side of the Rhine, preparing for a crossing.
So this is a weird scenario where you have you have this big adversary now encroaching on your sphere of influence. But what do? You only have 5 legions, unless he's re-upped that 5,000 that he lost in the Helvetii situation. He's only got 5 legions to defend this, unless he calls upon more men. It's a difficult little scenario right here.
This was getting serious. Caesar gathered his men and set off towards Ariovistus.
How many?
On the march, he got word that the German army was moving towards a town called Byzantio. This was bad. This town was well fortified, and Caesar wasn't interested in continuing negotiations with a guy behind strong walls, much less conducting a siege if it came to that. He left his supply wagons behind, and pushed his men forward at a breakneck pace, marching all day and all night, and arriving in Vesontio just before the Germans could reach it. He stayed there for several days, allowing his men to rest while his supply wagons caught up. When he was ready, Caesar marched out and closed in with Ariovistus' army. He sent messengers to set up a face-to-face meeting.
Ariovistus had some specific ground rules for the meeting.
He asked that exactly 10 men on horseback accompany each general. Caesar had cavalry, but they all happened to be Gauls, so fearing some sort of trap or betrayal, he had some of his most loyal infantry mounted on Gallic horses. This led to some of his men joking that he was treating them so well that he made them into equitae. If you don't get the joke, it's a pun. Equitae means both horsemen and a wealthy Roman. So the two generals and their retinues met on an open field. Caesar simply reiterated what he had told Ariovistus in his letter. He demanded that no more Germans cross the Rhine, that the Gallic hostages be returned, and the cessation of all military activities. Ariovistus said that this was now his province.
It seems that we are at an impasse.
Just as Transalpine Gaul was Caesar's province.
Yeah.
He said that he and the Romans had won their respective provinces through conquest, fair and square.
Ariovistus then leveled a threat,
saying that many politicians back in Rome would probably be overjoyed if he killed Caesar right now.
I wouldn't think that's a great idea to vocalize something to someone like Caesar.
Damn. This comment caused a fight to break out between the horsemen. Caesar would say that the Germans started it, but he would say that, wouldn't he? Caesar immediately broke off negotiations and...
Why does this guy have an underlying bias against Caesar? I don't know. I don't like that.
And had his men return to camp.
A few days later, Ariovistus sent another message,
saying that he was interested in another meeting. Caesar was understandably suspicious considering how the last one ended.
He sent his favorite Gallic interpreter to go and see what Ariovistus wanted.
It's a good thing he did, because in fact it was a trap.
Ariovistus took Caesar's interpreter prisoner,
and would spend the next several days arguing with his religious advisors over whether or not they should burn him alive.
Yeah, this guy's a maniac. Ariovistus.
As a religious sacrifice.
Ariovistus mobilized his army,
and in a surprise move marched all the way around Caesar's position and encamped on a hill behind him.
This put him in a good position to intercept Caesar's grain shipments. Not great for Caesar. Ariovistus was leading an army of around 30,000.
And Caesar had somewhere around 25,000.
Makes sense.
Caesar and Ariovistus both deployed for battle
5 days in a row. There was the occasional cavalry skirmish, but no outright attack. Caesar was now under pressure to attack before he ran out of food.
And with Ariovistus holding the high ground, this was a recipe for disaster.
So Caesar came up with a plan. He marched his army out of his camp in 3 columns, leaving a small garrison behind. He then marched just beyond the German hill.
Ariovistus saw what he was doing,
and sent out his cavalry and half of his infantry in response. Why only half? We'll get to that in a minute. Caesar had expected a German response, which is why he had his men in 3 columns rather than 1. He instructed 2 columns to turn and hold the Germans off, while the 3rd one began to construct a fortified encampment.
There was some skirmishing back and forth, but Ariovistus never really pushed in a coordinated attack, even though the Romans were out in the open and undeniably vulnerable.
When the 3rd line completed its construction, the Romans pulled back and the Germans didn't pursue. Caesar was now in a position where he could intercept his food shipments unmolested, which meant that he could take his time figuring out how to deal with Ariovistus.
Okay.
The next day was pretty uneventful, but late in the day, the Germans sent a raiding party to attack the first Roman camp, but Caesar had left a garrison and they were easily repulsed. During this engagement, some German prisoners were captured.
Under questioning, they revealed that Ariovistus had been told by his religious advisors
that victory was impossible until the next full moon. Aha! That explains why he was being so cautious. Caesar decided to take full advantage of this, The next day, he marched his army straight up the hill,
and Ariovistus did not challenge him.
Now both armies were on the hill. Caesar then deployed for battle, so close to the German camp that they had no choice but to fight. If you remember back to when Caesar fought the Helvetii, he had kept his 2 inexperienced legions in reserve at all times. Here, for the first time, he put them up front, which is a sign of their growing competence.
As Ariovistus' army prepared for battle,
Caesar observed that the Germans on the Roman right looked a little weak. That's where he positioned himself, and that's where he intended to win the battle. All of a sudden, the Germans attacked with amazing speed. It all happened so fast that the Romans didn't even have time to throw their javelins. They just had to drop them where they stood. Caesar ordered his first 2 lines forward, and kept his 3rd in reserve.
Ariovistus fought with some pretty unusual tactics, which are worth getting into here.
His infantry and cavalry coordinated very closely, and were organized in mixed groups of 100. The infantry acted as a solid wall, similar to a phalanx, while the cavalry would hide behind them and launch hit-and-run attacks, coming back to regroup when needed.
Okay.
Each group acted independently, which meant that there were hundreds of hits and runs going on at the same time.
Like mini corps.
It was extremely frustrating to deal with. As the battle dragged on, the Roman frustration started to show. Some dealt with the German walls of infantry by throwing themselves into them and ripping away the enemy's shields with their bare hands. I ain't never seen that in a movie. After some effort, Caesar was able to break through on the Roman right, just as he had planned. But with all of his attention devoted here, he was unaware that at the same moment, the Roman left was beginning to crumble. The commander of the Roman cavalry, Publius Licinius Crassus, son of Caesar's political ally, saw what was happening and launched into action. On his own accord, he went to the Roman third line, who were totally oblivious, and ordered them to come and reinforce the Roman left. The third line got there just in time, and the left held. This was an early example of the growing initiative of Caesar's subordinates, which would turn out to be a feature of the Gallic Wars. Soon afterwards, the German collapse on the right reverberated throughout the entire army. The Germans fell apart and fled. They continued their retreat all the way back across the Rhine, pursued by a horde of angry Gauls. Those hundreds of thousands of Germans waiting to cross the Rhine heard news of this defeat and went home. As luck would have it, after the battle, Caesar's favorite Gallic interpreter was found alive, but traumatized by the constant conversations about being burned alive.
Yeah.
Caesar would later say that discovering that he was alive gave him as much pleasure as the victory itself. With these back-to-back victories over first the Helvetii and then Ariovistus, Caesar would later say that he won 2 wars in a single summer. Rome was now well established as an indispensable power broker in the region. Caesar left his army in Gaul under the command of Labienus for the winter, and returned to his provinces to tend to his duties as governor. He'd be back next spring.
That was very quick and simple, but let's talk about it. So Germanic tribes, or Germanic peoples, Ariovistus being their leader, really are trying to take advantage of this migration. And there's so much migration happening in this day and age that it almost is like a concept that's hard to track if you try to compare it with, medieval and further time frames like 16, 17, 1800s. It's just hard to imagine all of this migration happening. Very much almost nomadic how these people are for trying to forage and get a better opportunity for their tribes and people. These ethnic groups are crossing the Rhine, giving them the opportunity to try to be in this, I guess, like flatlandish area, maybe. I'm not sure. It looks like this is like a combo between France and Lower Germany in like the middle, like in today's time. So I wish like we could figure out, looking at this, like the lines of like the different areas of what no man's land is versus like what are like claimed ethnic group lands. Nevertheless, Caesar becomes this like white knight protector for Gaul. in this regard. Twice now, Helvetii and now Ariovistus both really like this migration east to west, and he stopped both of them so far. 5 legions. He had 6, now he has 5. Imagine if he had more than that. This area is not very challenging either. It doesn't seem like this is a formidable force, this area. However, the tactics by these Germans were pretty interesting, with like the cavalry going back and forth. It really reminded me of like similar to how like more advanced cavalry in terms of like how I've seen in terms of like the Islamic tribes, how they've done it. So overall, 9 out of 10 here. Love it. I'll see you guys next time. I appreciate you guys sticking by. Peace out. Bye-bye.